Welcome back, my friends, to Faces of History, the show where we peel back the skin of myth and stare deep into the souls of the figures your textbooks love to flatten into one line and one label. I'm your host, the Duke of New York, and tonight we're traveling to the vast deserts and rocky canyons of the American Southwest, a place where history was carved with blood, grit, and unbreakable will. Tonight's Face of History is a name that echoes through time. Geronimo, the name they screamed as they jumped out of planes, the name they stamped on comic books, war chants, campfire tales, stripped of context, turned into legend. But Geronimo was not a myth. He was flesh and bone, an Apache warrior who lost everything, fought for what he loved, and outlived every promise ever made to him by the U.S. government. He was resistance embodied, stubborn, wild, proud, and he paid the price for daring to say no to manifest destiny. So pour yourself something strong, lean back, and listen close, because we're about to meet Geronimo, the last free warrior of the American frontier. All right, friends, pull your blanket tight and imagine this. High desert sun pouring over rugged mountains, ancient pines whispering in the wind, rocky ravines hiding secrets older than any border on a map. Long before history slapped the name Geronimo on him like a brand, he was just a boy. Goyaałé, the one who yawns, a name that makes you think of a sleepy child, but there was nothing lazy about him. He was born in June of 1829 into the Goyaałé band of the Chiricahua Apache, a people who believed the land wasn't owned but lived with. Every ridge, every stream, every cave had a spirit, a lesson. His people moved with the seasons, raiding when they must, trading when they could, fighting when they had no choice. This was Apache life. Freedom on horseback, survival by your wits, loyalty to your band and your family above all else. Picture Goyaałé as a child, barefoot in the canyons, learning to read tracks like words, learning the scent of water under desert stone, the taste of mesquite beans and peanut nuts. His father, Taklishim, whose name meant the Gray One, was no great chief but a respected warrior. His mother, Juana, taught him the stories that gave the Chiricahua strength, how to listen to the wind, how to read the stars, how to trust the spirits when the rifle and the knife failed you. Apache boys didn't have classrooms, they had the wild. At 6, he learned to ride a pony without a saddle, gripping the animal's mane as it raced across the sand. At 8, he practiced with a tiny bow. At 10, he hunted rabbits for stew. By 12, he rode with the older boys on raids against rival tribes. It wasn't savagery, it was survival. If you didn't raid, you starved. If you didn't defend your people, someone would come take what you had. In these years, Mexico ruled the land that would become Arizona and New Mexico. But borders didn't mean much to the Apache. They crossed them like mountain goats crossed cliffs. The Mexicans called them wild devils and wolves of the Sierra Madre. But for Goyaałé, it was just life. When he wasn't trailing deer or learning from his father, he sat by the fires and listened to the old men. He learned the ways of the medicine man, songs that healed wounds and whispered to spirits. He learned that dreams mattered. The Apache believed dreams could guide you, warn you, turn you from boy to warrior. One night as a teenager, he dreamed of a hawk that could not be caught. He told his mother, she said, "You will never be taken." The spirits had marked him, and soon the world would too. Goyaałé grew into a man who laughed easily, but whose eyes watched everything. He married young, a girl named Alope, with quick feet and bright eyes. She gave him 3 children. They set up camp near Llanos, in the shadow of the Sierra Madre, where his people had lived and died for centuries. By his early 20s, Goyaałé was already respected as a fierce fighter. Quiet but relentless, always the first to volunteer for a raid, always the last to retreat. He had no chief's blood, but the people trusted him because he never broke his word. If history had left him alone, maybe Goyaałé would have stayed just that. A hunter, a raider, a father by the fire. But history has no mercy for people who stand in its way. The seeds of tragedy were already growing, Mexican soldiers hunting Apache camps to pacify the mountains. White settlers drifting west, hungry for land the Apache needed for food, horses, family. Treaties signed in languages the Apache did not speak. Promises whispered by men who did not keep them. Young Goyaałé's world was about to shatter, and in the ashes of his peaceful camp, the world would meet Geronimo. So remember this part, my friends. Before the name echoed through barracks and battlefields, before the headlines called him savage, there was just Goyaałé, a boy who learned the land like a map of the soul, a husband, a father, and a man about to lose everything and find something terrifying in its place, an unbreakable reason to fight. Stay with me, because next we'll step into the fire that forged the legend, the blood and betrayal that turned the yawning boy into the nightmare of two nations. When people think of Geronimo, the name that echoes through war chants and campfire tales, they picture him as the old man on a pony, the ghost in the mountains, the nightmare who refused to die. But they rarely picture this moment, the night he buried his whole world in a single day. It was March 1851. Goyaałé, young, strong, a husband, a father, left his camp near Janos with other Bedonkohe men to trade for supplies. He promised Alopi, his wife, he'd return before the next sun touched the canyon walls. He left behind his mother, his wife, his 3 small children, a people who believed they were safe in the sacred heart of Apache country. While he was gone, Mexican soldiers from Sonora, the same men who'd been raiding Apache camps for years, hunting them like wolves, swept in under the flag of so-called pacification. They came with guns, knives, torches. They called it a battle. It was a massacre. They burned the wickiups, the brush huts the Apache called home. They cut down women, elders, children who couldn't run fast enough. When Goyaałé and his men returned, they found only smoldering ashes and silence. Imagine this, a young man standing in the smoking ruins of his entire world, the bodies of his children, his wife, his mother, gone to the spirit world in a single blow. No warning, no fight, no chance to defend them. He didn't scream, he didn't rage, he just knelt in the ashes and stared at the mountains. For days, he didn't eat or sleep. He prayed to Usan, the Apache creator, for a sign, a reason to go on. He heard nothing, but deep inside him, something older than hope woke up. It was something the Apache knew well. If life gives you grief, the only answer is vengeance. When he rose from that campfire, Goyaałé was gone. In his place stood Geronimo, the name the Mexicans would cry out in terror, the name American soldiers would mutter in disbelief when they found yet another burned supply train or empty outpost. Geronimo turned his grief into a blade. He joined forces with Mangas Coloradas, the giant of a chief whose name meant red sleeves. Mangas had been at war with the Mexicans since they first rode horses through Apache land. And he brought in Cochise, the legendary Chiricahua chief who once cut treaties with the Americans but never trusted them for long. Together, these men turned revenge into survival. They led Apache raiding parties across the Mexican border, crossing the Sonoran Desert by moonlight, striking outposts at dawn, vanishing into the Sierra Madre before a single cavalry patrol could catch them. Geronimo's specialty wasn't just the raid, it was the ghost-like escape. He knew every waterhole in the desert, every hidden pass through the cliffs. Mexican soldiers called him the Fox of the Mountains. They offered silver for his scalp, but every man who came for him ended up feeding buzzards on a lonely canyon trail. Legend says the name Geronimo was born during one of these raids. In one story, a Mexican soldier, pinned down as the Apache charged, cried out to St. Jerome, "Geronimo, Geronimo, ayúdame." St. Jerome, help me. But the only answer that came was a war cry and a blade in the dark. Some historians doubt that story, but it stuck. Geronimo didn't mind. He liked that the name spread fear from Sonora to Arizona. He liked that his enemies whispered it by campfires, swore it in barracks, taught their children to hush when they heard the wind. To him, fear was another weapon, and after what they did to his family, he would wield every weapon he could. But it wasn't just the Mexicans anymore. The Americans were moving in now, pushing west, waving treaties and rations one day, building forts the next, killing game and fencing waterholes that had belonged to the Apache for centuries. At first, the Apache tried to live with them, trade, talk, keep to the high ground. But as settlements spread, soldiers followed. Any Apache resistance was labeled banditry. Every Apache leader was marked for death or capture. The reservations were coming. The fences were coming. And Geronimo, who had lost everything once, swore he would never bend his knee to any flag again. So there it was, the furnace that forged the man. One night of blood that would set him on a path of 25 years of raids, escapes, battles, and betrayals. To some, he was a savage murderer who refused peace. To others, and maybe to himself, he was a father who'd buried his children and refused to bury his people too. Stay with me, because next we ride into the firestorm. We'll see how this man who mourned in the ashes became the most wanted ghost in the deserts of the West. Part 3, The Invaders and the Broken Promises. All right, my friends, picture it now. The mid to late 1800s. The desert sun still bakes the canyons. The saguaro cacti stand guard like green giants. The mountain passes echo with the cries of eagles and the soft tread of moccasins on rock. But all around the Apache, railroads are snaking west, telegraph wires hum like iron spider webs, and settlers roll in on wagons with their families, plows, and fences. For centuries, the Apache had been the storm that no empire could tame. Not the Spanish, not the Mexicans, not the early Americans. But now, with the U.S. Army fresh from crushing the Confederacy, there were new generals, new outposts, and new blue-coated soldiers willing to chase Geronimo's people to the ends of the desert. At first, there were treaties, paper promises, soft words. In 1872, the U.S. government struck a deal with Cochise, one of the greatest Apache leaders of all time. Cochise, old and tired of war, agreed to settle his people on a reservation in the Chiricahua Mountains, the same mountains they'd always called home anyway. To him, it seemed like a truce, a way to let his people rest. Geronimo, by then already famous for raids into Mexico, was wary. He trusted no government, no soldier, no agent who handed out flour one day and bullets the next. But for a while he went along. He wanted to keep his people fed. He wanted to protect the families who still looked to him for leadership, even though he never called himself chief. But the reservation was no sanctuary. It was a slow death sentence. Supplies promised by the Indian Bureau rarely came. Agents skimmed rations, sold beef meant for the Apache on the black market, pocketed the profits. Soldiers patrolled the edges like prison guards. If a man stepped off the reservation to hunt deer or gather medicinal herbs, soldiers labeled him a renegade. And the Americans kept moving the goalposts. First, it was, stay in the Chiricahua. Then it was, you must move to San Carlos. San Carlos was no fertile mountain refuge. It was a blistering, barren flatland where crops withered, disease spread, and whiskey traders lurked on the edges to make a quick dollar off a starving people. Geronimo hated San Carlos with every bone in his body. He called it Hell's 40 acres. No game to hunt. Bad water. Soldiers watching every move. For a man who had once roamed free from the Rio Grande to the Sierra Madre, this was worse than death. This was slow suffocation. It wasn't just the land that turned sour. It was the betrayals. Every time Geronimo signed a peace agreement or agreed to return to the reservation, agents broke their word. Promises to protect his people, promises to punish corrupt traders, promises to let them practice their ways, all gone the minute it suited Washington or the local Indian Bureau to break them. So Geronimo did what he'd always done. He ran. Again and again, when life on the reservation strangled him, he gathered a handful of warriors, sometimes 20, sometimes 200, and slipped away under the desert moon. Each time they vanished, the settlers panicked. Ranchers whispered ghost stories of Geronimo lurking behind every rock. Cavalry patrols hunted him through Arizona, New Mexico, even deep into Mexico's Sierra Madre, but they could never quite pin him down. To the U.S. Army, he was a fugitive. To his people, he was a protector. And to himself, he was simply a man refusing to die a prisoner. These weren't wild raids for the thrill of blood. Geronimo's people left the reservation to survive. They raided for cattle to eat, rifles to defend themselves, ammunition to stay alive. They hid in the Sierra Madre, the same rugged mountains that had sheltered the Apache for generations. The terrain was brutal, the distances vast, but the Chiricahua knew every hidden spring, every canyon pass, every cave where a family could vanish like smoke. But with every escape, the U.S. military pressure grew. Generals like George Crook and later Nelson Miles turned the hunt for Geronimo into a personal crusade. They poured in thousands of soldiers, scouts, cavalry, trackers. They recruited Apache scouts to hunt Apache holdouts. It was an ugly irony. Native men who knew Geronimo's trails better than any white officer, forced to hunt their own kin under threat of starvation or prison. Still, Geronimo slipped through their fingers again and again. He'd surrender, then flee again. He'd sign a treaty, then vanish into Mexico at the first broken promise. To the newspapers back east, he was a mad dog, a bloodthirsty renegade who refused civilization. To the settlers in Arizona, he was the bogeyman in the dark, the name they whispered when the wind rattled the shutter at night. But to his people and to those who understood the old ways, he was something simpler. A man who refused to be fenced in. A man who would not kneel. A man who saw every promise as a lie until proven true, and none ever were. So picture him now, an older man than the boy called Goyaałé. His face weathered like the canyon walls, his eyes still sharp as a hawk's. Watching the horizon for the next scout patrol, the next broken promise, the next campfire that might bring a bullet in the night. To some, he was a nuisance, to others, a rebel. But beneath it all, Geronimo was a mirror for America's own broken word. Every treaty signed in ink and broken in blood. And so the chase dragged on, year after year, until the day came when the last free Apache warrior would ride down from the mountains and say, "Enough. Stay with me." All right, friends. So far, you've met the boy who yawned at the world and grew into the man who made two nations tremble. But by the 1880s, that man, Geronimo, was one of the last free warriors left in a world that was closing in fast. Picture it, the vast reaches of the Sierra Madre. Brutal, beautiful, unforgiving country. Jagged ridges slicing the sky, hidden springs bubbling up in secret valleys, narrow canyons so tight a man could hide for days while soldiers stumbled past within an arm's reach. For generations, this land had protected the Chiricahua Apache. It was their fortress, their church, their final sanctuary when the rest of the world called them savages and penned them into reservations. Geronimo knew these trails better than any map. He could vanish into the shadows at dusk and slip across the border into Mexico by dawn. And he did, again and again. Each time he surrendered to U.S. forces, signed their treaties, gave them his word, and each time when the rations rotted, or the agents skimmed their food, or the soldiers forced him into some barren patch of dirt, he did what a free man does. He broke out. By the early 1880s, Geronimo had become a ghost story with a heartbeat. To the U.S. Army, he was the old renegade, the last holdout who refused to bow to the stars and stripes. To settlers, he was the boogeyman parents used to hush their children. Sleep, or Geronimo will come for you. But to the Chiricahua still running with him, the families, the warriors, the women carrying children on their backs, he was more than a war chief. He was hope itself. This wasn't some Hollywood warband tearing across the frontier for blood. These were families, entire extended clans on the run, old women, young children, warriors with one rifle between three men. Every raid on a ranch or wagon train wasn't just revenge. It was food, ammo, horses. It was survival in the teeth of the greatest military power in the hemisphere. They say in 1885, when he broke out of the San Carlos Reservation again, Geronimo was around 56 years old. 56! Picture that. An old man, by Apache standards, riding day and night across mountains and deserts most settlers wouldn't cross in wagons. His band, sometimes 20 warriors, sometimes 70, sometimes just a handful, outwitted thousands of U.S. soldiers and Mexican troops hunting them with the latest rifles, Apache scouts, and supply trains. No telegraphs in the Sierra Madre, no steam trains through the cactus flats, just word of mouth, rumors carried by traders and whispering winds. Geronimo's out there. And with every raid, every ghostly disappearance, the legend grew. But it couldn't last forever. The U.S. poured resources into the hunt, more men, more scouts, more deals with Mexico to chase him across the border. General George Crook, the Army's Indian fighting superstar, took it personally. He used Apache scouts, men who knew Geronimo's tricks because they'd learned them from the same elders. Betrayal? Maybe. Or maybe just survival for men whose families starved in the reservation stockades while the last free holdouts hid in mountain caves. Crook's strategy was simple. Wear them down, cut off the water holes, keep cavalry patrols moving day and night, bribe the Mexican army to sweep the other side of the border, track Geronimo's people until they were sick, starving, and exhausted. And slowly, painfully, it worked. By 1886, after years of running, Geronimo's band was down to a few dozen men, women, and children. Food was gone, ammunition was low, constant movement had broken bodies and spirits alike. And worst of all, Betrayals came not from the white men alone, but from within. Some scouts, distant cousins, former allies, were convinced to talk. Trails were revealed, hideouts marked on army maps. There's a photo taken not long before the final surrender. Geronimo sitting cross-legged, eyes like flint, a revolver laid across his knee. Look at that face, part defiance, part exhaustion, part sadness. A man who'd spent decades refusing to kneel, now staring at a choice with no good answer. Keep running until every last woman and child with him died in the desert, or lay down his rifle and trust the same government that broke every promise he'd ever heard. On September 4th, 1886, in Skeleton Canyon, Arizona, Geronimo surrendered for the last time. To General Nelson Miles, who replaced Crook after he failed to nail the old fox for good, it was a victory, the end of the Apache Wars. To Geronimo, it was a final, bitter compromise. He was promised he and his people would be treated fairly, sent to Florida as prisoners, but eventually allowed to return home to Arizona. But if you've been listening, you already know how this story goes. The promises turned to dust. Instead of being held as prisoners of war for a year or two, Geronimo and his band were exiled for decades, bounced from Florida to Alabama to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Home was gone forever. Yet even in chains, he never quite gave up his last weapon, his spirit. Geronimo, the Apache chief. He wasn't technically a chief, but who was going to argue with the last free Apache? So that's how the desert ended. Not in a blaze of bullets, but in a slow exile. The man who'd spent his life slipping through canyons became a prisoner of war for the rest of his days, paraded in Wild West shows, stared at like a curiosity, a relic of a world the railroad and the barbed wire had crushed. But in his eyes, in those photos, you still see the spark. The same fire that once carried him through dust storms and cavalry patrols, outwitting armies for decades. The last free Apache forced to surrender his weapons, but never quite his soul. Stay with me, because next we walk into part 5, The Prisoner of the Empire, where we'll see how Geronimo spent his final years. A prisoner and a showpiece. So there he was, Geronimo, once the fox of the Sierra Madre, the ghost in the canyon shadows, the last free Apache warrior, now living out his days under lock and key. A prisoner of war, they called him. But the war was long over, and the bars were more symbolic than steel. They shipped him east after the surrender, first to Fort Pickens in Florida, then to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, and finally to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Thousands of miles from his sacred Chiricahua Mountains, the desert sun he'd known all his life replaced by strange forests and humid plains. But the chains were the same. No freedom, no homecoming, no way back to the land that made him who he was. What do you do with a warrior when the war is over, but the legend refuses to die? You put him on display. That's exactly what America did. The same government that hunted him for decades now trotted him out like a carnival act, a living relic. Proof, they claimed, that the savage frontier had been tamed. At Fort Sill, he wasn't locked in a cell 24/7. He lived in a small cabin, farmed a little land, raised cattle. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, trousers, a jacket over his beaded shirts. He converted to Christianity for a while, got baptized. Maybe he meant it. Maybe it was a polite nod to the missionary officers who still held the keys to his fate. But Geronimo never stopped being Geronimo. He didn't hide who he was. If the white world wanted a show, he'd give them one, on his terms. They came by the hundreds to gawk, journalists, tourists, politicians. When the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair rolled around, the Army saw an opportunity. They packed up Geronimo, now an old man in his 70s, and put him on display at the Indian Village exhibit. Right there next to fake teepees and stage show war dances, there was Geronimo himself, signing autographs, selling photos of himself in war bonnets he never actually wore in battle. Think about that. A man once hunted like an animal, now signing his name on postcards for 25 cents a pop, and people lined up for it. It was grotesque and, in its way, brilliant. Geronimo took their curiosity and turned it into a side hustle. He knew he was a prisoner, but he'd sell them the legend if it meant he kept a shred of dignity on his terms. In 1905, Geronimo even rode in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade. Imagine that scene. The old renegade who once made whole cavalry units vanish into dust, now sitting tall on horseback, decked in beads and feathers for the crowd. The newspapers wrote him up as a trophy, the tamed savage, the proof that the American West was civilized. But Geronimo wasn't tame. After the parade, he asked Roosevelt if he could go home to Arizona one last time. He said he wanted to die in the Chiricahua Mountains, beneath the same cliffs where his ancestors hunted deer and made campfires that glowed like stars in the canyon. Roosevelt shook his hand, posed for the cameras, and said, "No, once a prisoner, always a prisoner." So he made his peace where he could. At Fort Sill, he farmed, he rode, he told stories to children, Apache children, Kiowa children, Comanche children. He taught them about the old ways, how to track in silence, how to read the wind and the rocks, how to hold on to your spirit even when the fences close in. In his last years, Geronimo dictated his autobiography, Geronimo, His Own Story, to an army interpreter. It's part boast, part confession, part final roar, from a man who wanted the world to know he'd never been defeated in spirit. He told it his way, how he saw the broken promises, the hunting trails that turned to train tracks, the agents who lied, the generals who came and went while the Apaches still endured. But time spares no one, not even legends. All right, my friends, we've followed him across deserts and canyons, through ambushes and broken treaties, to the final days of a warrior turned prisoner. But let's slow down and sit with this. What does it mean when a legend dies? Does it fade? Or does it slip under the skin of a nation, whispering in places where people think the frontier is long gone? By 1909, Geronimo was old, nearly 80 by some estimates. For a Chiricahua Apache born in the 1820s, that alone was a miracle of grit. He'd outlived nearly every general who hunted him, every Indian agent who promised him freedom if only he'd settle down and stay put. He'd survived battles, ambushes, betrayal, forced marches, filthy stockades. But no man escapes time. That winter was bitter and unforgiving. Geronimo, restless even in forced captivity, rode his old pony into Lawton, Oklahoma that night. Some say he went for supplies. Some say he was selling trinkets and photos, still trading on the legend the white world couldn't resist. Others say he went for whiskey, maybe to dull the ache in his old bones, maybe just to feel warm again. He was an old man on a horse, same as he'd always been, and maybe that night he forgot for a moment that his body could no longer do what it once did. On the way home, he fell from his horse. The man who once ran barefoot over desert stones for days on end lay alone in a frozen ditch all night. The cold did what the U.S. cavalry never could. It broke him. They found him the next morning, shivering, fevered, pneumonia tightening around his chest like a final set of chains. They carried him back to Fort Sill, the prison that was now his final home. He lingered for days, drifting in and out of consciousness, family at his side, a few loyal followers who'd stayed through exile and disappointment, soldiers nearby, watching the last ember flicker out. It's said, and oh, historians love this, that on his deathbed, Geronimo told his nephew he regretted ever surrendering. "I should have never given up. I should have fought until I was the last man alive." Maybe he said it, maybe he didn't. But listen to the shape of his story. Doesn't it sound like the truth? Even at the end, when his lungs rattled with fever and the mountains were gone, his heart was still running in the canyons of the Sierra Madre. On February 17th, 1909, Geronimo, Goyaałé, the one who yawns, exhaled for the last time. No bullet, no bayonet, no cavalry charge, just the slow hush of breath leaving the body, a death so ordinary for a life so fierce. But his burial was far from heroic. They laid him to rest at Fort Sill's Apache Cemetery. No mountain peak, no canyon grave, a simple marker. Geronimo. His people visited in secret, told stories at his grave. Over the years, rumors spread that grave robbers, Yale's Skull and Bones Society of all people, dug up his skull and carried it away to Connecticut to sit in a secret tomb alongside stolen trophies of empire. Truth? Folklore? Maybe both. Maybe Geronimo still laughs about that one in the wind. What's certain is that even dead, the U.S. government kept his descendants prisoners for decades longer, because if Geronimo could rise from that grave, the soldiers knew he'd break out again and take every soul with him back to the desert. Yet the man they called the Savage slipped free in the end. He's not in the textbooks, not like Custer or Kit Carson or the generals who shook his hands, smiled for the cameras, then sent him back to a prison yard. But you know who's still here? Geronimo. Every time you hear that name yelled from the open door of an airplane as a paratrooper leaps into the void, Geronimo, that's him. Stripped of the land, turned into a battle cry by people who never knew his story, his name still rides the wind. Soldiers shout it for courage, not knowing they echo a man who fought the very army that made him a ghost. And here's the truth, my friends. Legends don't really die. They slip under fences and treaties, burrow deep into our fears and dreams. Geronimo lives on every time someone questions a promise written on paper but broken on the ground. He lives in every resistance, every defiance against power that says, you will kneel. Kneel. He never did. Not really. So tonight, when you blow out, picture him, a man wrapped in a blanket, stars overhead, whispering to the old spirits of his mountains. They'll remember me. So who was Geronimo? A savage, as they called him, a rebel, a freedom fighter, a father, a husband, a holy man who spoke to the mountain spirits? He was all of it and more. His name is a battle cry and a brand. But behind that name was a man who lost everything and kept fighting because freedom was all he had left to lose. If you ever find yourself in the dry lands of Arizona, listen to the wind whispering through the rocks. Maybe you'll hear him still, the last Apache who refused to bow his head. Thank you for traveling through time with me tonight on Faces of History. I'm the Duke of New York. If you loved this story, subscribe, share it, and leave a review. And remember, history isn't just the past. It's a warning, a promise, and a ghost that never dies. Stay wild, stay awake, and always ask, who owns the land you stand on? Good night.